I'm Amit Khurana, and I work on the food-related issues at the Center for Science and Environment, New Delhi. I'm and as many of you would know, today's webinar is very much linked with the CSE investigation that was released a couple of weeks ago, which highlighted the issue of the business of adulteration by sugar syrups in honey. Adulteration, which is so sophisticated that it gets undetected. It also highlighted that how this adulteration business is actually not only a problem for the consumer health, but also a problem for the livelihood of beekeepers, and how it can possibly impact the issues of biodiversity and food productivity. So ever since we have released our study, hundreds of people from across the country wrote to us with their comments and questions, sharing their point of view on the problems and the solutions. And there was this great need felt to discuss these issues in detail with people from who are actually working on the ground. And as part of this series, CSC has actually already conducted one webinar with the beekeepers a couple of weeks ago, and it was very clear that the issue of adulteration is impacting their livelihoods. And today's webinar, which is with a different set of stakeholders, is about a different source of honey, which is a honey harvested by forest and tribal communities. And the intention is to see how it can be incentivized and encouraged. So we would be discussing different aspects of with these expert stakeholders today. And uh, we have with us the speakers, the guest speakers, and I will quickly introduce them uh, uh, one by one. And one, of course, so we have Matthew John with us. Matthew is a founder director of Keystone Foundation, Tamil Nadu. And Matthew will speak on biodiversity of bees and importance of standards that encourage biodiversity. We also have with us Stan Thekerera. Stan, please forgive me if I have not pronounced your last name correctly. Stan is a founder director of Just Change India, and again from Tamil Nadu. Stan will speak on how to link tribal producers to consumers. He would be talking about eliminating possibilities of adulteration and also share some insights on traceability of forest/community honey. Then we have Tapas ji. Tapas ji हमारे साथ जुड़े हैं सुंदरबन से. तपस जी बात करेंगे अपना एक्सपीरियंस से फार्मर प्रोड्यूसर ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस जो उन्होंने भी एस्टैब्लिश की है सुंदरबन में, अपने एक्सपीरियंस के बारे में हमें बताएंगे. I also have with me the team from CSC who has worked on this issue for the last many months. I have with me Sonal Dhingra and Arnab Pratindatta. Sonal and Arnab have been part of the team, and Sonal will be presenting today the CSC part of the investigation that we did. But I'm most happy to actually to convey that Sunita ji has joined us today, and Sunita ji, she's the head of CSC, and I can tell you without her guidance and support, this study investigation would not have happened. So Sunita ji and all the panelists, a very warm welcome to all of you. And Sunita ji, of course, will conclude this discussion once we hear from the guest speakers and take up the question and answers. With that, I would just like to tell how we will go about it. So I will request my colleague Sonal first to briefly tell about what CSE has found. Then Matthew, I would come to you, request you to share your point of view, and then to Stan, and then to Tapas. Followed by that, about 10 minutes each. We can then move on to about, let's say, 25 to 30 minutes of about Q&A, and I would request the participants to put their questions on the Q&A box so that the panelists can see and accordingly take up the questions, which I would be moderating. And then, of course, I would request Sunita ji in the end to conclude the discussions. So without taking much time, I will move on to the actual discussions. So Sonal, can you please start?
Yeah. Thank you, Amit. Can everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I will start by presenting CSC's findings on the business of adulteration that we found. I'll start with letting everyone understand first that why we did this investigation in the first place. It was important for us because we were hearing a lot of distress stories from the beekeepers who said that their livelihoods are threatened because of this honey adulteration business. And secondly, public health is in danger because of adulteration in honey, because people are consuming honey for the health benefit it confers. And very often we see that many of us take honey in the morning. That's the first thing we take in the morning with warm water. So it was important to understand and highlight this issue and bring it to public. And this is why we did it. And this is what we found. Yeah. So the first, I'll start with our lab results. We found that we tested about 13 brands of honey. Some of them were processed honey, and the others were raw and unprocessed and unpasteurized honey. Out of the 13 brands we tested, only 3 passed. Surprisingly, only 3 of them passed. And of these 13 brands, we had tested 22 samples, of which only 5 passed the test of adulteration. And to largely say that only 77% of the samples actually passed the adulteration tests we conducted. This was actually dangerous because the 77% honey is not it did not pass. Now, why is it dangerous? Because it has a huge impact on our health. Because as I said, that for the health benefits it confers, many people were consuming honey for immunity boosting. Honey is known to be an immunity booster, and especially in COVID times, people were consuming it. But what if it's honey? If it's not honey, it's sugar. It's actually going to make our health worse. It's going to make us overweight. It's going to affect people who are already overweight and obese. And it will hit our health very badly. So, and the findings suggest that if one is already, with COVID-19 is worse when it's coupled with any comorbidity such as obesity or overweight. So we wanted to understand that what is this syrup, how is it affecting, and I'll give you a little details on our lab tests that show that these syrups that are designed are actually designed in a way that can pass Indian standards. So the first thing we did was that we sent 13 brands to an Indian lab, which was called National Dairy Development Board, NDDB India. And we sent these syrups, we sent these, the honey brands in the lab, and it was found that most of them actually passed the Indian standards. It actually passed on the Indian standards, except for one. And the smaller brands that we sent failed on the Indian standards. So the processed honey passed and the smaller brands failed. And the findings were such that the honey was found to be adulterated with C4 or C3 sugars. But what was an actual eye-opener for us was that when we sent the same samples to Germany, a lab in Germany, it completely changed the picture for us, because all these samples that passed the Indian test actually failed in the German lab. In German lab, we conducted 2 tests. These were the advanced tests, one on trace marker for rice, TMR, and the other is nuclear magnetic resonance, which is NMR. Interestingly, TMR is one of the parameters that has been dropped by FSSAI recently in the 2020 standards. It was there earlier. And we found that many of these samples actually failed on TMR, and almost all of them failed on NMR except for 3. We'll get into the details of the samples that failed. So these are the 6 processed honey samples that failed: Dabur, Patanjali, Apis Himalaya, Baidyanath, Zandu, Hitkari. These are the small honey brands, the niche brands that failed. Dadev, Indigenous, High Honey, Society Natural, and two of them, Dadev and High Honey, actually also failed on the very basic tests that were conducted in the Indian lab. So it shows that they were adulterated with C4 sugars. These are the three brands that passed: Safola, Markfed Sona, and Nature's Nectar. One out of the two samples that we tested of Nature's Nectar passed on NMR. Now we'll move on to understand what this syrup is actually. We have been talking about sugar syrup a lot. Just to briefly give you how we got to understand this syrup, we saw that a lot of Chinese companies that we rummaged through were advertising these syrups that they can pass the Indian tests such as C3, C4, foreign oligosaccharides, SMR. And we also saw that there were Indian manufacturers who said that there's an all-pass syrup that can pass the Indian test. So we spiked our honey, raw honey, with these syrups, details of which I'll come to later. I don't want to lose the chain of thought on syrups. So these syrups is something that the business of adulteration of these syrups has actually evolved, and it's only developed to beat the lab test to beat the standards of Indian regulator. And which is why we think that the business of honey adulteration is very sophisticated, and it's still evolving. It's going to get worse. And we would not say that the government of India, it's a big concern globally, and we would not say that the government of India was oblivious of it, it did not know. We think that the government knew that there's something wrong, and which is why they have been coming up with notifications and directions time and again. And time and again, they've also been revising the standards of honey purity, finally operationalizing it in July 2020, which is why the government has also mandated NMR test for honey that will be exported. So the government knows it, but what we think is that they've only been so far nibbling around the edges, and they hadn't gone deep into the problem, which is why the FSSAI directive that says that the import of golden syrup, invert sugar syrup, and rice syrup that is used for adulteration should be scrutinized. While it was actually not golden syrup, invert sugar syrup, and rice syrup, it was the fructose syrup that Alibaba and likes of Alibaba have been advertising that can bypass the Indian tests, which was actually a lead for us, the Alibaba websites, that it's the fructose syrup that's being exported. And we also found that the same Chinese company that advertise on Alibaba are also exporting to India this fructose syrup. Now, the issue is the syrup exists, but it was difficult for us to break this honey gate, but we managed to do it. And our investigator, my team member, he sent emails to these Chinese companies to asking for syrups that could pass test in India. And these are the same Chinese company that say that they are selling fructose syrup to India. They can sell, they've been exporting fructose syrup to India, and they advertise that they are selling syrups that can pass C3, C4 test. And not very surprisingly, we also received replies from them. They said that the syrups are available and those can be sent to India. And they also mentioned that even if we adulterate honey with up to 50 to 80% of these syrups, it would not be detected in the stipulated tests, which is why we tried to get these the syrups. And the Chinese company that exported the syrup to us, it exported under the category of paint pigment, and it routed it through Hong Kong to bypass any custom clearance. It was not just India. We also heard that the Chinese have set up factories in India. It was not just China. They had also set up factories in India. And we found that there were manufacturers available in Jaspur, Uttarakhand, and they were selling the syrup. And the code word used for such syrup was all pass syrup. So we made a contact with the person and we procured this all pass syrup. And the owner said that it can pass all these all the tests that are prescribed by FSSAI. The next logical step was for us to spike raw honey with these syrup, and we spiked it at the level of 25%, 50%, and 70%, sent it to the Indian lab, NDDB, and we found that these samples, when adulterated up to 50%, could pass the test of purity. So which confirmed that these syrups actually work. What they advertised was actually true. They can pass the tests. Now, this was a very critical point where we knew that something as bad as syrup is going into the honey, and it's very critical for not just our health or livelihood of the beekeepers. It's also critical for the overall health system, because if there are no bees, if there are no beekeepers, there are no bees. And bees are known to be important pollinators. Without them, the food safety is threatened, and the planetary health is threatened. So it was important for us to bring this issue out, and it is now important to take steps in this regard. It's important to outwit the business of adulteration. It's important to stop the imports of syrups that are being used to adulterate honey. It's important to strengthen the enforcement in India so that the testing can be regularized, the random testing can be done without by keeping these companies responsible. And traceability is something that really needs to be worked on, to understand what is the origin of honey, what hive is it coming from, which beekeeper is it coming from. So this is the time then when we need the honey companies to be responsible for this. And as a consumer, it's also responsible. The consumers have also be responsible. They should know. They should be able to tell just by looking at the honey, tasting it, smelling it, if it's real honey or not. I think it's high time we move on from looking for clear, pure, clear and clean honey. It's high time we understand what honey looks like. So this was CSC finding, and I would stop my screen here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sonal. Thank you for very succinctly bringing out, and in a very simple way, bringing out these key messages. And I just want to share this with with the viewers here, that the details of the study, detailed story, the down to earth story in English and Hindi, the lab results of both the labs, as well as the our press statements which have been followed after the study release, are all available on our website for any one of you to take a good look at. So thank you, Sonal, once again. So with that, I move to Matthew. Matthew, please share your thoughts.
Yeah. So hello everybody, and nice to join this panel and to discuss about, we've been discussing about honey, but I think very important is the source of honey, and that's bees. And I thought I will share something from our experience in these hills based in South India. As Keystone, as a civil society organization that has been working with honey collectors, they are honey hunters who've been doing this for thousands of years, and also to bring in the marketing aspects of it, which has been done through Last Forest. This first slide that you see, I'm going to show you 5 or 6 slides which talk about different aspects that we need to consider when we're talking about honey and bees. And so I think very important that we remember that there is an entire tradition and culture when bees are involved, honey is involved. And if you look at the photograph on the right side, you see a honey collector who is at least 300 feet from the ground. He comes down, he collects this honey. There is a certain symbiosis that exists in nature where the bees and these honey hunters, they become part of that ecosystem. And we need to understand that each one of these honey hunters, they have a face, they have a story, they have a home that they are a part of. And we need to constantly remember that if it's not just part of that culture, it would not exist anymore. Yeah. Very importantly, when we talk about honey and bees, we need to remember sustainability. I think honey cannot be just produced out of thin air. We need bees to do that. And this activity has been continued because they are very conscious as collectors, as honey hunters, that there is sustainability involved. If they are not conscious enough, there will be no bees and no honey available for next year. Very importantly, the function that we forget about that the bees provide us is with pollination. Pollination, when we look worldwide, and if you see certain studies that have been done, the bees, the services that they provide has been estimated to be close to $500 billion. That's the value of pollination services that bees provide. What is the amount of exports that we are talking about, whether even just from India? We're talking about a couple of $100 million. There's no comparison between the pollination services they provide. More than 1/3 of the crops, they are pollinated by bees and other insects. And actually, if you look at that valuation of $500 billion, it's just a monetary value. There's no replacement of that. And if there's no replacement, then the valuation is infinite. And that sometimes we forget, that apart from honey, that there is a whole aspect of pollination that the bees provide. Very importantly is to look at diversity. And I put this photograph here. We tend to look at honey and just tend to think that it's just golden color. No, I mean, I don't have photographs here, because if you go up to Kashmir, you will have honey which is nearly white in color. And that's because of that geographical area from where honey is collected. That nectar, that pollen, that gives that diversity, not only to the honey. I think very important for me to state here is the diversity of people who collect that. They live in different ecosystems. They have their entire tradition and culture, which is able to bring out this diversity in the ways they collect honey and in the ways honey is available to us. And we need to keep that diversity alive. At the end of it, if people's livelihoods are not being met, I think there's a big disservice that we're doing to these people. Whether it is honey or whether it is byproducts from honey, which is beeswax, you can have communities that are dependent on this and that can generate livelihoods. So it's not only people who, in most places, it is the men who are going out for honey collection. There's a very small minority of women who are involved in beekeeping, but it is, when it comes to value addition, there can be many more women who are involved with that. I think this is something that we are constantly struggling with, but I think we need to understand that we need to not only look at very technical standards which government regulations can bring into place, whether it is moisture content, whether it is pollen count, whether it is HMF values. There can be many, and there are 18 to 20 of those that are there for under FSSAI. But how are we ensuring that customers pay the true cost of the product that they are consuming? And for me, it is important that we don't take this we take this not only for honey, but all food that we consume, all food that is on our table. Are we willing to pay that true cost? Most of the time, much of our food, when we get it through our public distribution system, it is subsidized. Yeah, and it is subsidized because it is on a scale that is industrial and which is monocultural. But we never pay attention to the services that bees provide. Lastly, I just want to talk about the complementary roles of institutions that we have that are able to take care of these different kinds of efforts that go in. So as Keystone, we are able to work on sustainable harvesting practices, work with the community people, work on the rights that they have and that they are able to take forward. As Last Forest, we take on the enterprise part of the work, where the value systems are very important and we are able to put that out to the customers. And lastly, but not the least, that there is a producer company that works directly with these communities. That is part and parcel. It is made up of these communities. They run it, they manage the entire thing, and they are primarily trading with forest produce. I will leave it there, and then I'm open to questions when we have a discussion. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Can you just, yeah, okay. Great. Thanks, Matthew, for actually igniting our minds. I'm sure the viewers would now get to know what are the larger issues. I mean, issues of culture, sustainability, livelihood, diversity. I mean, the fact that you're talking about true cost, payment for ecosystem services. I'm sure the ground is set for much more insightful discussions now. So thank you, Matthew, for this. With that, I move on to Stan. Stan, over to you, please.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I see there's an amazing number of over 200 people who have signed in. That's quite a feat. So I'm glad to have this opportunity to speak to all of you. But I'd like to, before getting into this, I just want to say thanks to CSC for taking the lid off the honey pot and exposing the can of worms below, because that is what this really is. And we should, and CSC has called it out for what it is. And those of us who are working with the original, genuine honey gatherers, honey hunters, beekeepers, cannot but be grateful for what you have done, because the challenge that we have all been facing from the plethora of brands and honeys that you see on every supermarket shelf, with no story of where this honey comes from and how it comes, this at least now raises that issue. So before I go into this thing about honey with us, a little bit of background. We have been working here in the Nilgiris in the Gudalur Valley. We are neighbors of Matthew. We have, both our organizations are very close to each other and have been supportive of each other. We are working on this side of the hill in the Gudalur Valley on the western side. And we started basically working with an organization which we founded called Accord, which was working on the land rights and other rights of the Adivasis. And through that, we formed a tribal organization called the AMS, the Adivasi Munitra Sangam. The AMS in turn teamed up with other producer organizations and producer communities across India, and formed the Just Change India Producer Company. And under this Just Change India Producer Company, we have been marketing the honey of association of persons, which are of honey gatherers. Currently, there are about 240 members, and that number is growing. And they call themselves the AMS Ten Kootam, or the AMS Honey Collective. So it's against this background that we are talking. We market honey through the Just Change Producer Company under the brand name Be Wild. So now I come to the honey per se, and more than focus in the product, I'd like to spend a little time on the people behind this product. And here where we live in the Gudalur Valley, it's mainly Katnaikens, the Katnaiken Tribe, who, like other tribes all over there, and as Matthew mentioned, have been for centuries, have been collecting honey from the forest. And this has been the mainstay of their economy and their livelihood. And so for them, honey is much more than a product. Honey and honey gathering is a way of life. It is not even a livelihood. I hesitate when people describe this as a livelihood. It's much, much more than that. It's a whole, Matthew again mentioned a culture. It's a way of life. It's their identity. So many things. So just to give you a couple of stories regarding this, one of the stories that the Katnaikens tell their children, which we have heard repeatedly, is that the bee first makes a pact with the tree. The bee goes and asks permission of the tree to build a hive. And I won't go into the entire story, it's a longer story, but briefly ask permission of the tree. And if the tree says yes, only then will the bee build a hive there. But the bee also asks the tree, says that, once I build a hive, sometimes the bear might come, and then sometimes there's a Katnaiken fellow, he might come climb up your tree and take the honey. Are you okay with that? And it's only if this permission is given by the tree, the bee starts building a hive. The tree doesn't give a the permission, then it moves to another tree. And this is the explanation the Katnaikens give as to why some trees have hives and some don't. Because the ones that don't have hives are the ones that did not give permission. So then when the Katnaiken goes to collect the honey, the Katnaiken takes the permission of the bee again and thanks the bee and asks forgiveness. There's a whole ritual by which this has happened. Then asks forgiveness of the tree because he'll be climbing the tree and that they should be protected. And when they do this, they say this is why the bees do not sting them when they go to collect the honey. And this is why no Katnaiken has ever fallen off a tree and been injured, because the tree protects them. They have a pact. There's this relationship. And finally, there's a very interesting story, is that when we asked the Katnaikens here in Gudlur about bringing out the wax, because they were only bringing honey, there's no beeswax. So we asked them, what about the wax? Why don't you bring the wax? There's money in that as well. And till date, the Katnaikens have refused. In fact, even yesterday, just yesterday, we had an email from one of our customers asking us whether we could give them a piece of live honeycomb with some honey in it. And the Katnaikens say no, because they leave the wax for the bear, because they say that's the bear share. And it is because they make this pact with the bear does not attack them when they go for honey. The thing behind the story is to show that when everybody uses this jargon and they say symbiotic relationship with nature without really understanding what it means. But basically, they see themselves as a part of nature and everything in nature having an equal right. And they respect that. So now this way of life, of where they were one with nature and they had very sustainable practices of harvesting the honey and so on, over the last few decades have been under, or maybe more than decades even, have been placed under threat. Because ever since the colonial times, the forest became the property of the crown, and subsequently, since independence, it became the property of the state. And so the Adivasis and people like the Katnaikens became encroachers or trespassers on their own homelands and on their own way of life. And so there was this practice of going into the forest like they were thieves in the night. And they themselves had come to believe and internalize the fact that they were stealing the honey from the forest. And so these delicate relationships between the rest of nature are then placed at threat. But fortunately, with the Forest Rights Act, all our villages, all these communities that we work with have all laid and have presented their claims under the community forest rights, and are now able to go a little more confidently and collect the collect the honey. And we are now trying to bring back, and this is where again we are turning to Keystone for a lot of advice and training to harvest this honey in more sustainable ways, because now they don't have to be afraid of the forest department or anybody else. But one issue I'd like to raise at this point is that there is a big question mark of whether this way of life will continue. Because as part of modernity, every single Katnaiken child goes to school, and we have to admit that we were part of that process. We encouraged that process. I'm still not sure whether we were right in doing that, because now by going to school, the Katnaiken child does not learn from their parents of how to collect honey, and nor do they develop that skill, because it's a highly skilled job to climb you saw some of the photographs that Matthew showed. Going down those cliffs and climbing up those trees is high skill, and that not everybody can do. So what will happen to the next generation? Honestly, we don't know. But what we are trying to do is we are also trying to introduce whether we can move from forest hives to hives in bee boxes. So at least the knowledge that this community has accumulated over generations and over centuries can in some form be preserved. What the Katnaikens don't know about honey is not worth knowing. So, but there is one more thing I would like to, some time back, Mari, my wife, was writing an article for the New Internationalist on honey, because they had a whole issue on honey. And we were talking to the Katnaikens, and they said something very interesting. They said, for the first time, we see dead bees. And we said, what are you talking about? I mean, they said, no, the bees are so small, they die everywhere. We don't see them. We don't see them dead. But now we see them dead. We see hundreds of them lying dead in one place. And we said, why? What happened? What are you talking about? And they said the estates all spray pesticides and weedicides, especially weedicides and on the forget-me-nots, and that's a flower that the bees go sit on. And as a result, bees are now dying. They die in their hundreds. So I'm bringing these points in just to bring in the issue that we are talking about a very, very important part of an ecology. The bee and the work that the bee does. This is under threat. It's not just the life or the way of life of honey gatherers. It's not just their livelihoods, but we are actually threatening an entire ecosystem when we endanger bees in one form or the other. And so finally, let me just come to the product before I sign off about honey. What has stunned us over the last few years, a decade or two, is how the growth of honey as a product and the number of hundreds of brands and the number of shelves in supermarkets that sell honey. And you wonder, where is all this honey coming from? And when we started selling our honey, one of the most common questions we are asked is, why is this honey so costly? You're saying 1,000 rupees, 1,200 rupees for a kilogram of honey. Dabur is selling for a few hundred. Why can't you get Dabur? And to them, I say, there is honey and then there is real honey. And we have always wondered, how come these honeys that are on the supermarket shelf can all look identical? They all look the same. They smell the same. They taste the same. Whereas people like Matthew will all tell you that, we get honey coming from two different villages, and the two honeys taste different in the same locality, in the same environment, because they've got honey from different trees. And Matthew showed you that picture of so many types of honey, different colors. So how is that our supermarket sell one single kind of honey? It's like trying to say there is only one kind of apple or only one kind of tomato, and there is no diversity, there is nothing. So clearly we have suspected that there is some issue here, and but this, we don't have the wherewithal to prove it, and this is where we owe a huge debt of gratitude to CSC for having exposed this and proved what we always suspected, that there is adulteration, there is some kind of manipulation, and this is not real honey. I'll come now to the issue that, again, we have faced from many of our customers. How do we know it is pure honey? And so the whole issue of traceability. For this, we are a bit mischievous. I always quote a group of organic farmers in Mysore. When a friend of mine went to buy rice from them, and he asked them, how do I know it's organic? Their reply was, who asked you to come and buy from us? If you don't trust us, why buy from us? And so on this issue of traceability, I have my doubts about third-party certification, like organic certification. Many consumers will push for that. But in today's day and age with technology and all that, my advice to consumers and what we are telling all our customers is establish a relationship, establish a link with the actual producers. You can do it. We have the technology now to do it. Why don't you establish some kind of link so you convince yourself, you take the trouble to convince yourself that your product is genuine. Why do you want a third party to put a label, to say it's pure, like FSSAI? And we know that there are 101 ways of getting around these standards. I don't want to touch on the larger issue of state. Of course, at a global level, at a national level, there are many issues, and we need, we need policy changes, we need regulation. All this is there. But in today's day and age, I think the safest bet is to establish direct link with the producers, so that you know for a fact where your honey is coming from, and that for that matter, any of your products, and not just honey. And so to people who ask me, why is your honey that you all are selling from the Katnaiken so expensive? Why is bee wild honey so expensive? The answer we always give is that a Katnaiken goes into the forest, braving elephants, tigers, pythons, bears, literally risking his life. And not only that he bears the wildlife of that forest, he climbs up these huge trees, again risking his life, goes down these cliffs risking his life, and then he depends on his centuries-old knowledge and the pact that they have built, the community has built with nature around them, to bring this honey out of the forest and bring it to your table. What price do you pay, sir? place on that. To me, it's priceless. And no amount of money that anybody can pay for their honey is a just thing. So with that, I will just end. We have a short 2-minute video about the AMS Tenkuttal, which I will ask, I think Sukanya or Sonal, one of them are going to play it. And with that, over back to you.
The AMS is a federation of 315 tribal village sangams and has 8 area collection centers. A few years ago, a court helped the Katnaikens to collectively market their wild honey under the brand name Be Wild. The Katnaikens have now formed a self-help group called the AMS Tayan Kutam, which has now entered into a marketing agreement with Just Change India producer company. The honey collected by the Katnaikens is weighed at the AMS collection center. Right in front of them, Basivan, the person in charge of the collection. He logs details about the weight, type of honey, and number of people in the group into a mobile app developed by a court. By scanning the QR code, each individual's details are captured, including the total amount due, savings, and the balance payable. Jaya, the area secretary, is able to verify these details on her computer and enters this into the passbook of the individual. The cash is paid instantly. This honey then goes to the Accord Processing Center, where it is bottled and packaged for the market. This center also packs other items like spices, coffee, and tea, marketed by Just Change. We ensure utter transparency throughout the process and eliminate the Katnaiken's dependence on unscrupulous local traders. This has empowered the community to undertake complete ownership and be the primary financial beneficiaries of their own produce, thus allowing the Katnaikens to sustain their legacy.
Okay, so thank you very much, Stan. I mean, how can I actually thank you for such deep insights into the way honey is collected, about bees, about beekeepers, about traditions. So thank you very much, Stan. I hope this gives all of us some real perspective on how the honey that is sourced from forests, let's say, or by the tribal communities, is different from honey which is perhaps industrially produced. So thank you very much, Stan. With that, मैं चलता हूँ तपस जी की तरफ. तपस जी, आप शुरू करें, please.
मैं पहले थैंक यू देना चाहेंगे CAC को, जो गिविंग मी दिस अपॉर्चुनिटी टू शेयर आवर व्यूज. बेसिकली हम लोग का जो ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है उसका नाम है सुंदरबन जन श्रमजीवी मंच. हम लोग 1 दशक के ज़्यादा हम लोग यहीं पे सुंदरबन में फॉरेस्ट राइट एक्ट लागू करने के लिए कोशिश कर रहा हूँ. लेकिन यहीं पे फॉरेस्ट राइट एक्ट लागू नहीं होने के बावजूद यहीं पे जो हनी कलेक्टर है इसका बहुत प्रॉब्लम हो रहा है. बहुत प्रॉब्लम इसका जो स्टैन ने बोल रहे थे, जो यहीं पे जो फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट है यहीं पे जो लोग सुंदरबन के अंदर जाते हैं इसके जाने के लिए उसका एक टेम्पोररी पास देता है जिसके नाम है BLC, बोर्ड लाइसेंस सर्टिफिकेट. क्योंकि ये जंगल का अंदर किसी का घर नहीं है तो जंगल का अंदर जाने के लिए जो नाव लेके जाता है उसका बोर्ड लाइसेंस सर्टिफिकेट देता है. और जो बोर्ड लाइसेंस सर्टिफिकेट फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट देता है वो अंदर में जाने के बाद जो हनी कलेक्ट करते हैं वो जब लाते हैं तो फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट उसका 100% हनी उसका ले लेते थे पहले से. तो मूवमेंट करने के बाद अभी थोड़ा जो राहत आया है तो वो लोग हनी अभी छोड़ रहा है, जो थोड़ा बहुत वो लोग ले रहा है. मैं RTI किया था 2018 में, तो वो लोग बोल रहे हैं जो दे कैन हनी कलेक्टर कैन सेल हनी टू अदर्स. दैट मीन्स अभी सुंदरबन का जो लोग हनी कलेक्ट करने के लिए जाते थे, जो अभी पहले जब सुंदरबन का अंदर का जो हनी जब फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट ले लेते थे वो मोनोपोली कर रहे थे. जैसा मोनोपोली करने का कोई अभी तो कानूनी का जो कार्रवाई है जो उसी मुताबिक होना चाहिए, फॉरेस्ट राइट एक्ट के तहत होना चाहिए. क्योंकि नॉन टिम्बर फॉरेस्ट प्रोड्यूस एंड माइनर फॉरेस्ट प्रोड्यूस जो है तो वो तो नहीं ले सकते हैं फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट. तो अभी जो हुआ है, जो फॉरेस्ट का अंदर जो लोग जाते हैं, जो हनी लेके आता है, तो वो हनी जो फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट लास्ट ईयर में भी बहुत भाव नहीं दिया था और बहुत कम भाव में वो लोग लेते हैं। बेसिकली लास्ट ईयर में लिया है पर किलो 135 रुपया, 135 पर किलो। तो ये सब देखने के बाद हम लोग कोशिश कर रहे थे, वो जो हानि फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट के बाद जो गांव में आता है जो हानि, तो ये हम लोग एक चर्चा किया था कितना हानि हम लोग के पास आ सकता है। तो हम लोग देखा है यहीं पे दोनों टाइप का हनी हम लोगों के पास मिल सकता है। एक है जो लोग ट्रेडिशनली हनी कलेक्टर है, जो जंगल के अंदर जाते हैं और 10-15 दिन जंगल के अंदर रहते हैं, उसके बाद वो हनी कलेक्ट करके गांव में वापस आते हैं। ऐसा जो हनी है जो एकदम जंगल का सुंदरबन का अंदर का हनी, ऐसा दो रेंज में हम लोग ये किया था, चर्चा किया था। दो रेंज का जो हानि हम लोग का गैदर करेंगे कितना होगा, तो ये मिनिमम 500 किलो हम लोगों के पास आ सकते हैं। और दूसरा जो हानि है, जो दूसरा जो हानि है 500 नहीं 5000 किलो हानि हम लोगों के पास आ सकते हैं। तो बेसिकली दूसरा जो हम लोग चर्चा किया था, जो यहीं पे जो लोग बी कीपर है, ट्रेडिशनली बी कीपर है, जंगल का आसपास बॉक्स लेके बैठता है और उसके बाद जो हानि कलेक्ट करता है, इसका जो हानि है कितना हो सकता है। तो वो टोटल मिला के हम लोग दे रहे थे 2100 क्विंटल हानि हम लोग के पास आएंगे। तो ये सब हानि जब हम लोग के पास आएंगे तो ये लेके हम लोग क्या करेंगे, पहले तो लोकल लोग को पैसा ज्यादा नहीं मिलता है। लोकल में जो फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट देता है जो 135 किलो पर किलो, और जो बी कीपर का हानि लास्ट ईयर में बिका है 71 टू 80 पर किलो। और मैं डाबर के साथ बात किया था, डाबर बोला तो सुंदरबन का हानि तो ज्यादा से ज्यादा हम लोग आप लोगों को ये दे पाएंगे, वो 90 से 95 रुपीज दे पाएंगे। तो ये सब देखने के बाद हम लोग चर्चा किया, जो ये सब जो हानि जो मार्केट में आ रहा है, वो हानि का तो ज्यादा भाव है, ज्यादा दाम भी भाव ज्यादा है, लेकिन लोकल जो हानि कलेक्टर है और बी कीपर है, इसका भाव ज्यादा से ज्यादा नहीं मिल रहा है। तो हम लोग ये सब चर्चा करने के बाद हम लोग एक एफपीओ फार्मर्स प्रोडक्शन कंपनी बेसिकली बनाया है। अभी वो नया बनाया है और 26 नवंबर को इनॉग्रेशन हुआ है। लेकिन अभी जो हम लोगों का पास जो बहुत सारे प्रॉब्लम जो है, एक तो है जो हानि हम लोगों का पास आएंगे, इसका मार्केटिंग का लिए जो चर्चा हम लोग शुरू किया है नाफेड का थ्रू, हम लोग डिसीजन कराया है। तो नाफेड सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट का ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है और वो जो नेशनल जो एग्रीकल्चरल मार्केटिंग कोऑपरेटिव फेडरेशन ऑफ इंडिया जैसा है जो है, उसके अंदर ये किया है। तो इसके थ्रू जो हम लोग का जो हानि आएंगे, इसका जो प्रोसेसिंग यूनिट बनाना पड़ेगा, इसका मार्केटिंग का चेन बनाना पड़ेगा, और बाहर में जो हानि हम लोग लेके जाएंगे तो उसका ज्यादा से ज्यादा भाव मिलेंगे। तो ये सब देखने के बाद हम लोग ये किया है, हम लोग ये फिक्स किया है जो कैसा हम लोग क्यों हम लोग हानि एपीओ बना रहा हूँ। हानि एपीओ इसलिए बना रहा हूँ, लोकल लोगों का जो ज्यादा भाव है, जो लोकल जो हानि कलेक्टर है बीके उसके थ्रू जो पैसा मार्केटिंग करने के बाद, जो कंपनी लेने के बाद जो आएंगे, वो पैसा भी उसके पास डिविडेंड के थ्रू उसके पास आ जाएंगे। क्योंकि हम लोग का जो एपीओ फार्मर्स प्रोडक्शन कंपनी बना रहा हूँ, उसका 100% स्टेक होल्डर है जो हानि कलेक्टर है और बी कीपर जो है। अभी हम लोग के साथ 2000 का करीब लोग अप्लाई किया है इसके अंदर आने के लिए, और 2000 फैमिली इसके साथ जुड़ जाएंगे। और ये बेसिकली नॉन प्रॉफिटेबल ऑर्गेनाइजेशन हो रहा है, नॉन प्रॉफिटेबल कंपनी हो रहा है। तो इसका जो 100% जो ये होगा, जो प्रॉफिट होगा, जो प्रॉफिट 100% ये अकॉर्डिंग टू देयर शेयर प्राइस, शेयर उसका थ्रू उसका पास बांट देंगे। तो ये इसके ये कंपनी होने के बाद ये लोगों का दो टाइप का फायदा होगा। एक तो पहले से जो हानि कलेक्ट कर सुंदरबन से जो हानि ले रहा है, कलेक्ट करके जो ला रहा है, जो उसका भाव तो पहले से ज्यादा मिल जाएंगे। और दूसरा है जो उसके बाद जो हम लोग का जो हनी हम लोग के पास कंपनी के पास आने के बाद जो प्रॉफिट होगा उसका भी 100% इसके थ्रू डिविडेंड के थ्रू इसके पास चला जाएंगे। तो बेसिकली यहीं पे कैसे जो बोल रहे थे जो स्टैन साहब ने और जो पहले वक्ता ने जो बोला है, जो यहीं पे भी हनी कलेक्शन एक कल्चरल फिनोमेनन है, यहीं पे एक ड्रामा है, बेसिकली वो फोकलोर जैसा है, उसका बोलता है दुखे यात्रा, बेसिकली दुखे का ड्रामा है। तो वो लोग एक बहुत ट्रेडिशनली कैसे ये लोग कलेक्ट करने के लिए जाता है, इसके लिए ये रामायण महाभारत जैसा है, इसके कहानियां भी है। तो ये सिर्फ हनी यहीं पे जो कलेक्ट करता है, ये सिर्फ ऐसा नहीं है जो धंधा करने के लिए जाता है, इसका बेसिकली कल्चरल फिनोमेनन है। वो साहब ने सही बोल रहे थे, स्टैन साहब ने, जो अभी इसके बाद जो लाइव रिस्क है, सुंदरबन का जो टाइगर आपका तो मालूम है एकदम बाय नेचर मैन ईटर है, और हर साल में मिनिमम 10 से 15 लोग का मौत हो जाता है, और उसका कोई भी मुआवजा नहीं मिलता है। तब भी लोग हनी कलेक्ट करने के लिए जाता है, मछली पकड़ने के लिए जाता है, क्रैब कलेक्शन करने के लिए जाता है, लेकिन गवर्नमेंट का तरफ से जो भी होना चाहिए, यहीं पे जो कार्रवाई करना चाहिए, मिनिमम जो मुआवजा देना चाहिए, ये सब नहीं हो रहा है। ये सब चैलेंजेस है ही हम लोगों का साथ, बहुत दिन से हम लोग लड़ाई भी कर रहा हूँ, लेकिन अभी तक बहुत दूर जाना बाकी है। अभी सिर्फ हम लोग कंपनी रजिस्ट्रेशन कराया है, लेकिन मार्केटिंग कैसे होंगे, कैसे ये काम कर पाएंगे, वो अगले दिन हम लोग बता पाएंगे। तो अभी इस टाइम में जो सीएससी ने जो इश्यूज ने चर्चा कर रहे थे दो हफ्ता से, हम लोग वही देख रहे थे, यहीं पे जो हनी है ये तो एकदम लोकल हनी है, और इसके साथ दूसरा जो हनी का जो चर्चा चल रहा है उसका कोई मिलावट करने के लिए, जो एडल्ट्रेशन जो करने के लिए कोई भी ये नहीं होगा, क्योंकि हम लोगों का जो प्रोड्यूसर है, खुद जो प्रोड्यूसर है, डायरेक्ट प्रोड्यूसर हम लोगों का पास हनी लेके आएंगे। और दूसरा जो है, जो इसके साथ जो लोग जुड़े हैं, इसका भी सुंदरबन एरिया में जो लोग हम लोग के साथ जुड़े हैं, इसका भी इसका फायदा मिल जाएगा। तो अभी हम लोग का यही शेयर करने का था, जो हम लोग जो कर रहे हैं, डायरेक्ट हनी कलेक्टर के साथ, हनी प्रोड्यूसर के साथ, हनी बी कीपर के साथ मिलके एक कंपनी बना रहा हूँ, और इसके थ्रू जो डायरेक्ट मार्केट में रियल हनी कैसे हम लोग लेके जा सकते हैं, ज्यादा से ज्यादा रियल हनी, वही चर्चा कर रहा हूँ और वही कोशिश कर रहा हूँ। थैंक यू टू ऑल।
तपस जी बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया, थैंक यू वेरी मच ये बताने के लिए तपस जी हम सबको कि सुंदरबन में कितना मुश्किल है, कितना खतरनाक भी है, कितना जोखिम है बी कीपर के लिए, बी हंटर के लिए, और ये भी बताने के लिए कि कैसे अगर सप्लाई चेन को छोटा कर दिया जाए तो उससे अडल्ट्रेशन का इशू रिजॉल्व हो सकता है। तो I think we have quite a lot of questions now, and there are broadly these questions could be segregated into two. One, of course, these are addressed to us, the CSC colleagues, CSC team, about our study and what we have found. And I hope that part of those are already answered by Sonal's presentation. But of course, we will try and see how much we can address in the limited time. We'll try and cover as much as we can with the help of my colleagues. The other part of the questions are, of course, to our guest speakers, which we would take on first. So what I will do is I will try and moderate this discussion to the best of my capabilities and pass on the questions to the guest speakers here. So there's this one very interesting and very common question that has come up again, is on pollens. So, and I also know, Matthew, you have some view around the pollen standards and the pollen count, and of course the other parts of the standards such as moisture. So my request to you would be, please share your thoughts on that. Let all of us know what you think. Matthew, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, yeah. So before I get into things like pollen counts and moisture content, I think we need to look at the standards of honey that we have sort of in our country that we have built. And it is not only FSSAI, which is a much more recent institution that has come up. It goes way back to when Agmark was the sort of sole authority that, the stamp that used to see on many food products. And what we have done in our country is we have taken standards which exist in the West, which is for a very different species of bee, which is Apis mellifera. And that in its own geography has that kind of standards which you can adhere to. But we are in a country which has those species now have been brought in, which is Apis mellifera from Europe. But we have 4 species of bees which are native and indigenous to our own country. We have Apis dorsata, which is the rock bee, which I showed you photographs about. We have Apis cerana, which is the bee that is, you can domesticate. And you have beekeepers all along the Western and Eastern Ghats who do migratory beekeeping with them. And then we have 2 more species of smaller bees. We have never taken into account these bees, the honey that is available from them, and build standards based on that. We have taken standards which are not applicable to our country, and I think that's very important to start with. If you look even so the two that you mentioned, you talked about moisture content and you talked about pollen counts. I mean, those are 2 that readily come to mind. If you look at moisture content, recently, I think a year and a half ago, we've made moisture content that should be the maximum of 20%. This for me can never prove the purity of honey that we are talking about, because moisture content in our country, when we are in tropical spaces, can go up to 23-24%. And that's truth from the ground. Why do we take a standard which is 20% and is not applicable to us? Yes, it can be applicable in areas which is, if you move from Kashmir all the way down to Haryana, Punjab, and upper parts of Uttar Pradesh. Yes, that can be applicable there. So to create one standard which is applicable for all species of bees doesn't make sense. We also have the issue of pollen counts, and that's where the syrups have come in. And this was when we had a pollen count of 25,000. That was where FSSAI also started. And then in the middle, a year or so ago, we had the pollen count dropping all the way to 5,000. And that's when actually there was a lot of discussion in the public space of why have we dropped our pollen count to 5,000? Because then it allows syrups like rice syrup, corn syrup to become and be called honey. And so when we play around with these standards, which we have actually not taken a base, our understanding of the reality on the ground, then we lay ourselves open for these kinds of mess. So I think it's important that maybe regulation is, yes, for sure, regulation is important. But how does regulation ground truth, its regulatory framework, with experience from the ground? How does it bring civil society people? How does it bring honey hunters? How does it bring that empirical data into a regulatory framework? And I think it's very important that these 2 sets of people, scientists, maybe from universities or from any other spaces, but also people who are working with these communities, bring it together. And then we have a regulatory framework which is much more alive and applicable to our country.
Okay. Thanks, Matthew. And when we figured out this, we also realized that the pollen count changed from 50,000 to 25,000 and then to 5,000. So our research also says that.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand why that happened and how much of that, as you said, has actually helped the adulteration business. So there's this another question around this question about fair trade. I mean, and I would request Stan to kind of come up here and talk about it. Somebody mentioned that fair trade can help the issue. You talked about true cost. You talked about the actual cost, and Matthew also talked about payment of ecosystem services. While Stan, you were speaking, somebody mentioned that fair trade can help the issue. So if you have any thoughts on that, Stan? You need to unmute yourself, Stan.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot that. As many of you will know, fair trade in India is still not caught on as much as it has in the West, especially in Europe and in America, and it's growing in America. We were exporting not honey, but our tea and other products through the fair trade network. And there is no doubt that it helps because it brings ethical or conscious consumers directly in link with the producers. But I think fair trade does not go far enough, because fair trade again simplifies the issue by just saying that the consumer pays 15% more and that should solve it. But there are much deeper problems of functioning within the market economy. And we started Just Change because of that, realizing the shortcomings of fair trade. If you take tea, because we don't have experience of selling our honey through fair trade, but with tea, the amount that the fair trade route could sell for us was a small fraction of our total production, which does not really make any impact. So it's by itself, it's a good idea. We should do it. We should push it. But the time has come now, and we have the technology now to go beyond fair trade. We need to go beyond fair trade and create direct links. And Just Change seeks to do that. And we position ourselves as fair trade plus. We're trying to go beyond fair trade.
Okay. Yeah, Matthew, you want to say something?
Yeah, more to say on that.
I just want to show a photograph. I think it is, maybe let me just share my screen. Is that it's important that even at a community level, you can create enterprises which are not only what Stan was talking about, fair trade, but it's also fair trade plus. In terms of how do you ensure that not only there is fair trade at the customer end, but all the way back to the producer, and all along the value chain, you are providing not only fair prices, but you are taking care of many other factors: health, hygiene, environment. How are all those issues taken care of? And so if you are able to involve communities into that process, I think you will be able to provide them a much better livelihood space.
Okay.
If I could just add in one more quick remark here, is that building on what Matthew said, I think the time has come for us to literally go beyond fair trade in a more significant way, because fair trade looks at the economics of it. It's basically putting a amount on it. But really, we have to look at fair trade, we have to look at sustainable trade. Where, like Matthew said, right from the production to the consumption, we have sustainable practices, because in this era of climate change and the threat to the environment, we really need to broaden our horizons. Fair trade was great when it started in the 60s. They exposed many things and it built up and all that, but we really need to take it to the next level.
Okay. So there's another question about, and I also have that question in my mind. The question about, after hearing you also, the question about how do you mainstream what you are producing, how it can be done, how to bring real honey to the consumers. Of course, what you said is about a limited set of geography, a limited set of part of the overall consumption. How do you scale it up, if at all it should be scaled up? So Matthew or Stan, anyone, please.
Scale is not an answer to everything. And I think, especially when we are talking about food products, and especially in an era of COVID, yes, for sure, there are products that we would like available all throughout the country. But I think it's also very important. And so I'm not discounting that, there are food products that are produced and are whether it is oils or wheat or dal, which goes across the country. But I think at the same time, it is important for us to look at local markets, to look at direct linkages. And if we do not build at any point, so it's not necessary that I buy directly from a producer, but if I, in my own market, if I, in my own Kirana store, I start asking that person for local produce. We ask that for vegetables. For sure, we ask that. Is my garlic local? Is my potato local? Start asking that for other products too. Get those products into your local stores. And I think to that extent, it may not solve the entire problem, but it will be a starting point.
Okay. Stan, you want to share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, just I think this the scale issue is something that we are always also asked about. How do you scale this up and etc. I'm thinking aloud here. One concern I have about the scale is that it's again playing into the hands of a capital economy, where growth and scale is vital to this. So I think looking at what Matthew is saying about local, I would say even decentralized economies or decentralized markets, this monolithic kind of thing of marketing is what is creating a lot of these problems. So I'm not sure, Amit, what you had in mind when you're talking about scale, but I think we should start with the producer communities. What are their products? And if you actually look at it and you decentralize it, we are not looking at, each community does not have massive amounts. It's when you try to aggregate all of it, you get a very large figure, and then you're looking for a market for it. So I personally prefer to start from a community base and see how you support a community to build a market for their products. And of course, the starting point has to be local. But when you have a product like us, and this is what we have done with Just Change, we have linked community groups to be able to trade their products with each other. So our tea goes to a community in Orissa, a community in Nagapatnam, and so on. And products from other communities come to us, and that's the thing. But when you come to some products like honey, the amount that is consumed by poorer community groups across the country is limited. And there are many other artisanal products which require an urban market and need to market at a very different level. But there again, we need to look at creative ways by which, what Tapas mentioned, shortening that market chain and actually building a relationship between the two ends of the market chain, and not to have the middle control what is happening and the middle keep the producer and the consumer as far apart as possible. We need to shorten that chain and create these links.
Okay. Thanks, Stan. There's one last question, a bit more technical, about the floral composition, which has dwindled over the last couple of years, and how that has impacted the quantity of honey extracted. Anyone, Matthew, Stan, how that is impacting the quality of honey, and of course that is impacting the adulteration business also. You need to unmute yourself, Matthew.
I think we need to look at it from the pollination angle. And that is because our bees, our 4 species of bees, they pollinate at very different strata. They pollinate in very different ecotypes and ecozones. And they allow, in our country, to keep that biodiversity alive. When we bring in Apis mellifera from Europe, what we have done is, because there has been so much work done over the years, Apis mellifera has become very monofloral in terms of its pollination. If it starts feeding on sunflower, it continues to feed on sunflower to the exclusion of any other flower. What our bees do is that they feed on all flowers. And so there is no one species which is able to dominate. That then provides us the diversity of our honey that is available to us.
Okay. Thanks.
Tapas ji, add up something. Tapas might probably have more.
तपस जी, आप कुछ कहना चाहते हैं? अभी जो हमने कुछ 4-5 सवाल पूछे, इसके बारे में आप संक्षिप्त में अपना मत बताएं।
बेसिकली मेरा जो बोलना था मैंने बोल दिया है। बेसिकली मार्केट चेन शॉर्टन करने के लिए हम लोग जो किया है, बेसिकली यहीं पे सुंदरबन में तो थोड़ा सा बोल दिया, यहीं पे बहुत सारे बिचौलिया है, मिडिल मैन है। हम लोग को प्रोसेस खत्म करने के लिए कोशिश करना है। पहले बड़ा मिडिल मैन यहीं पे फॉरेस्ट डिपार्टमेंट, उसके बाद है दूसरा जब मिडिल मैन है यहीं पे जो लोग जंगल के अंदर जाता है उसका तो पैसा नहीं है ज्यादा कुछ, तो वो दूसरे लोगों के पास उधर लेके पैसा लेके जाता है, और जिसका पैसा है वो पर डे 5% इंटरेस्ट लेता है, और वो जब हनी कलेक्ट करके गांव में आता है वो सस्ते में वो खरीद लेता है और दूसरा कोई कंपनी का देता है, और वो जो जैसा ये चेन में जाता है तो वो दूसरा जो कंपनी का पास जाता है वो एडल्ट्रेशन, वो तो ज्यादा से ज्यादा पैसा कमाने के लिए वहीं पे वो कोई मिलावट कराता है। दूसरा जो चेन है, जो लोग हनी बी कीपर है उसका जो हर साल में साल भर वो जो हनी बी कीपिंग करने के लिए जो पैसा लगता है, उसके पास ज्यादा पैसा नहीं रहता है। तो बड़ा बड़ा कंपनी उसका दादन देता है, दादन बोलता है लोकल लोग, वो पहले पैसा दे के रखता है 2 लाख 3 लाख रुपया। उसके बाद जो हनी वो लोग बी कीपर लेके आता है, वो सब कंपनी के पास पहले दे देता है। वो टेस्ट करके बोलता है कि इसमें ये भाव है। वो उसके पास कंट्रोल करने के लिए दूसरा कोई ऑप्शन नहीं रहता है बी कीपर के पास। तो वो लेने के बाद वो उस टाइम पे वो बोल देता है 70 रुपीज और 45 रुपीज, जो बोलता है उसमें वो देना पड़ता है, क्योंकि वो पहले से पैसा देके रखा है। तो हम लोग ये चेन जैसे ये चेन खत्म करेंगे तो डायरेक्ट मार्केट में ये रियल हनी पहुंच जाएंगे। वो ही कोशिश कर रहा हूँ। और ये जो टोटल जो चर्चा हो इसमें ये स्टैन साहब ने जो बोल रहे थे और मैथ्यू साहब ने, तो बेसिकली ये चेन खत्म हो जाएंगे तो थोड़ा सा छोटा जगह से हो, जो भी हो, ये शुरुआत हो सकता है। जहां पे है लोकल कम्युनिटी के साथ शुरू करेंगे तो यहीं पे रियल हनी ऐसा जैसे डायरेक्ट मार्केट में जाने के कोई चेन बन जाएगा तो शायद ये थोड़ा कम हो जाएंगे। थैंक यू।
ठीक है, तो अभी कुछ ऐसा जो क्वेश्चंस हमारे सीएससी की स्टडी पे आए हैं, उस पे कुछ देर चर्चा करते हैं। तो मैं अपने आई वुड रिक्वेस्ट माय कॉलीग्स Sonal and Arnab to kind of join me in responding to this. There is a question on how about which brands are good, and I know Sonal in her presentation has already communicated to the viewers. There were 3 brands which were not found, which passed the adulteration test, even the advanced adulteration test in Germany, and Sonal has clearly mentioned those. Then there's a question about how could our understanding on the brands be so uniform, meaning, so Sonal, if you could just briefly, the question is about we saying that all the processed honey, for example, were not got caught here but in Germany. The question is about how this could be so uniform, and we know that it is not uniform to a certain extent. Would you like to share some thought on this, the pattern of adulteration between processed, raw? Please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. It was only for the sake of brevity that we said that we categorized into processed and raw, and we said that it was the processed honey was not adulterated, was not found to be adulterated on the Indian standards. I'll give you a bit of details. We tested 13 brands, of which 9 were processed honey and 4 were raw honey samples. And we found that out of 9, 8 passed on the Indian standards, and 4 did not pass on. 3 out of 4 did not pass on the Indian standards. The difference between the processed and raw was very beautiful. It came out very beautifully. There are 2 types of sugars: C3 sugar and C4 sugar. C4 sugar, the source of C4 sugars are corn and cane, and source of C3 sugars are rice and beetroot. C4 sugars are very basic sugars that are added in the honey, and C3 sugars are a bit complicated, advanced, and it's very difficult to detect because honey itself has C3 sugars. So it's difficult to detect. What we found in processed honey samples was that probably it was adulterated with the C3 sugars, what came out in the NMR and TMR test, maybe rice syrup, and the raw honey samples were adulterated with very basic cane sugar or corn sugar because they did not even clear the C4 tests of adulteration. So this was the difference that came out, and maybe the big brands are adulterating it with the rice syrup, and the smaller brands that are selling raw honey are adulterating it with C4 sugars, which is a very basic adulteration. So it's not uniform across these brands. We have data which is available. We have the report which is available on the website. You can see there are nuances to each and every sample, and each and every sample has a different data set that is available on the website.
Thank you, Sonal. But of course, we can very clearly say that most of the processed brands actually were not detected. The adulteration in them could not be detected in India
Yeah.
this picture changed when we moved on to advanced testing in Germany. So Arnab, if you could very quickly respond on something like the home testing kit, home testing for honey, how to detect. What is your understanding on that? If you could let everyone know.
I think, traditionally we've had these different techniques of testing honey. These would include basically mixing honey into water and seeing whether it kind of dissolves in water. There's also, you take some honey and you burn it at the end of a wick, and it's a blue flame, that means it's pure honey. If it's an orange flame, it is not. But having worked on this story and having spoken to a lot of people on the ground, and also the samples that we got, both from China and from Jaspur in India, it's quite evident that the old traditional tests no longer work. Because when you have complicated tests like the C3, C4 tests and your TR1 and SMR, and if these are passing these tests, right, the ones that we do at home, I mean, they stand no chance before this adulteration. And just to add one bit to what Sonal said, most likely it is going to be rice syrup, advanced rice syrup, modified rice syrup, because the company from whom we got this syrup from in China, both the companies, right, they were basically making rice syrups. So not just rice syrups, but rice products. So they also made rice syrup, they also made rice protein, they also made sorbitol. And a similar thing was also seen in the factory in Jaspur, because they also had the same products in their lineup. So yeah.
Thank you, Arnab. I saw Matthew and Stan smiling on this. Matthew, you have any comment on home testing? Do you think that works now? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. After reading CSC's story, I mean, I don't know what level of home testing will you be able to do. Though, we do simple tests which are prescribed by the Central Bee Research Training Institute in Pune. So we do those tests. But with this, all it does is it just tells us a level of whether it has been adulterated or not. But now with these kinds of, additions going on, it puts all of us into doubt, to what level of testing are we going to get into, at small scale levels, community levels. There's really no chance for us to be able to deal with, when even a lab like in NDDB had a difficulty in, was not able to detect this. And that was the first specific honey lab that was created in India. And that I think was just this year or late last year that came into being. And so with all that investment in India, that was not able to detect. So at a home level, what Arnab was saying, I mean, those are the ones that everybody talks about. But beyond that, I have no answer.
Okay.
I think there's only an element of trust, and that goes back to what we were talking earlier, that if we have to push for local markets, local producers to be able to access local markets, and there we have to have an element of trust, that when we build that trust, are we able to access food which is available, wholesome and healthy for each one of us.
Yeah. Thanks, Matthew. So, Stan, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to add to, the last point. I was just going to make the point that Matthew made. I mean, whatever test we do, home tests and so many things, we are also looking on there, trying to find out what tests there are, because customers keep asking us and all that. And I think the final test of the quality of a product has to be based on your relationship with your producer, having some kind, I'm not saying that you have to come and meet the producer, come there, but somewhere you should have knowledge of who produced what you are consuming, and you have to have trust. The trust is a single largest element. So when a community tells you, listen, we do not adulterate the honey, our moisture content might be high, but that's not because we adulterated. That's because our ecosystem here, our climate results in that kind of moisture content. So that trust has to be there. And that is what we have been able to establish recently through one of the honey campaigns that we had, where we tried to sell honey during COVID. We had a pay now, get later. And we sold all our honey stock within the pace of 1 month, where people paid money upfront, and we delivered it after the lockdown was raised. And so there's a huge amount of trust, and that is the real kind of currency.
Okay, right, Stan. So just very quickly in the next 30 seconds, I will respond to 2 or 3 questions, and then I will request Sunita ji to kind of share her concluding remarks. One, of course, is honey from the Himalayas. Have we tested? So no, there has been no testing essentially around that honey sourced from that region. But there was also no such attempt to see from this region or that region. The idea was to figure out the popular brands in our country which are consumed most and see where do they fare in terms of purity tests. The other question is about the why NMR is not for is for exports and not for domestic. That is, of course, a question, very valid one. We had also kind of I mean, this kind of this announcement when it happened sometime that since August 1, NMR would be mandatory for exports, was also something that gave us an insight into our study and investigation about why this kind of and the importance of NMR and why it should happen or not happen in the domestic scenario. So that I would just like to say to all our viewers, we have tried our best to attempt to answer as many as we could. There are quite a lot of questions still unanswered. We'll try. I mean, because of the lack of time, it always happens. But we hope that with this discussion, most of the queries, by and large, are addressed. So that's what if there are, I mean, we of course would seek your forgiveness if we have not been able to address one particular question which you think is very important and has left unanswered. So with that, I move on to Sunita ji. Sunita ji, request you to share your thoughts on way ahead, concluding remarks, and the discussion that has happened so far. Please.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Amit. Firstly, let me thank all the panelists. Fascinating. I mean, I learned so much listening to all of you. And so thank you, Sonal, for putting this together. I think what I would like to say is that this is the second in our series. We did the first with beekeepers, and those were beekeepers largely from North India. And they were the ones who were our whistleblowers. So we thought we should learn from them first. And that was a fascinating dialogue as well. And if I want to take back some of, the one takeaway I got from that first dialogue was the way, it is just not about adulteration. That, of course, is really, really making their life unbearable. But very much along the lines Matthew talked about, what Tabachi talked about, what Stan talked about, the beekeepers are essentially, and these are more organized beekeepers, these are people who are managing, who are doing bees through boxes. They were talking about the enormous skill that goes into the management of this business. And I think that whole, whether it's the forest dweller, or whether it is the beekeeper in across different parts of India, we need to value their knowledge, skill, and labor. I mean, the ability, the fact that they have to move boxes to where the flowers are, they need to know the flowering season, and then they take the bees there, and they were explaining to us the skill that it takes, the effort it takes, the passion it takes. And I took back from that first dialogue we had was the enormous passion that I saw of these people. They're not just here to do any business. They believed strongly in the business they were doing, and they knew it very well. So I think the first thing we need to recognize is this enormous skill. The second thing that I took back from that first webinar, and which connects the dots with this second webinar in a slightly different way, is the whole issue of declining productivity because changes in the ecosystem. Now, in the first case, what they were telling us is that they are finding there is less nectar in the plants today, that the plants are being designed, hybrid seeds in the market are designed for pollen and not for nectar. In fact, CSC is now doing research on this. We want to understand, is this actually happening? talk to agricultural scientists, and we want to organize another webinar just on this issue, because this is serious. I mean, if you are designing your plants in a way that you will lose out on nectar, you will lose out on bees. If you lose on bees, you lose pollination. And that, I think, is critical. In this, today's Matthew, Stan, and Tapas have brought to us a different way. The linkage here is really about the forests, the ability of forest dwellers to, one, collect the honey, which is they not being treated as illegal trespassers. And the other is, of course, if the forest dwindle, then the honey will dwindle as well. So, and then of course there is the, so I think that whole question about ecosystem and bees is going to be critical for us to look at, and the health of the ecosystem and bees. And in this, Amit, I would also say to you, another part of the work that you should do, which is related to another element of your work in CSC, which is pesticides. Because the use of pesticides and declining bee productivity is well documented across the world. And we are beginning to use those same pesticides in India. And that's what the beekeepers pointed to us last time. So I think bringing together as I wrote, they're harbinger species. See, I mean, I learned that from when I was reading about what Stan, Matthew, Tapas write about, talk about. I mean, I picked this up, but I think what I'm really talking about, they're indicator species of the health of our ecosystem. So we need to join these dots and talk about these dots, because bees are about the future in terms of productivity. And I think if we can link this, this would be very good. The other issue that I think comes out very clearly is really biodiversity. And this is where, Stan and Matthew and Tapas and everyone else who are listening, one of the things that are the ironies, and we need to talk about this because we need to actually talk about it and make difference here. The Western world is always preaching to us about biodiversity conservation. And European Union is seen to be a champion of biodiversity conservation. Yet their definition of honey is the honey that is produced by mellifera, Apis mellifera. I mean, how can you say that Dorsetta or any other honey, Sarana, which produces honey, is not honey? I mean, this is the death of biodiversity. So I think we need to talk about the whole issue of biodiversity, not from the point of view, and we need to challenge the people, the champions of biodiversity, that please stop talking about biodiversity as it is protected and conserved in the wild. We want to talk about biodiversity as it is in our lives, on our plates, in our diets. And you need to accept the fact that we cannot have this extremely hypocritical situation in which we talk about biodiversity on paper, and yet we say that the food we produce has to be one which is monoproduced, which is one species produced. And I think this is something that we need to take forward more and more as we go ahead. The other very interesting issue that comes out is really how to scale and not to scale, and the market linkages. And I think, Amit, there I very much agree. I think the fact is that here, instead of having one singular notion that everything has to be at the scale of Dabur or Patanjali or any one of these other amazing companies, I don't have a problem with them. They do their business, that's fine. As long as their business is good for nutrition, good for health, it's fine with us. But I think we need to talk about scaling down now rather than scaling up only. And scaling down in today's world, post-COVID, is definitely much more possible than ever before. So we are talking about e-commerce. We are talking about how we can connect producers to consumers. how the markets are changing. Well, this is the real change that is coming in our own lives. I mean, and it doesn't mean that it has to be elitist, that only the elite can buy, good honey, and they can be the one who can source it from far away. I see e-commerce happening across. So I think we need to make sure that we can actually scale down. And that's where the opportunity is enormous. I mean, you could have the tapas model, which is an amazing model, which is producer companies. Same thing that Stan is doing, same thing that Matthew, you could have producer companies, and then you could have aggregate of different producer. You could aggregate different producer companies, but each with their own identity, each with their own control, each with their own biodiversity, each with their own local production's traceability. You don't have to set up a massive traceability system. You actually set up a traceability system which is much easier to manage because I know who's bringing it to me. Okay, and there is a connection between them. But that's where, I mean, I think about the Amul model that Kurian set up. And in a sense, what we are saying is recreate the Amul model, but in the world of e-commerce. It's a different concept, where when Amul did it, he had no e-commerce. Today you have e-commerce. And you could actually think of doing the same Amul model, which is individual producers tied to a larger production processing house. You could do that through multiple processing houses. And that's where I think the whole issue of standard setting needs to differentiate between what would be called processed and what would then be called community honey. I mean, we have to devise this intelligently, because what scares me is that then you will get a faceless regulator setting a standard which will actually be like the organic standard, which destroys the small and promotes the big. Yeah. So we need to be able to set those standards with tremendous care and tremendous confidence that the regulator actually will care for the community and will not discount the community in the name of the big. If that is the case, my approach would be let the regulator worry about the big, because in any case, they can't catch the big. But let them at least worry about catching the big companies, and let the small, the million flowers bloom. Let them not even worry about those, because they really can't. They cannot have the ability to be able to plan for diversity. And that's where I disagree, Matthew and Stan, that if you want standards which plan for diversity, I think you will find that you will have huge loopholes in the standard setting, and the big will get away. So we need two sets of standards, and we need to devise them very carefully, knowing that the big don't use the loophole of diversity to basically adulterate. And that's going to be something that is going to be important. And to bring it to my last point, Amit, is something that worries me. And I want to discuss this, and I don't know how you will approach this, Amit. But at some point, you and Sonal will have to have the courage to call a webinar of the raw honey producers who failed the test as well. Because one of the things that worries me is why did they fail? And in fact, they failed, as Sonal said, on the basic adulteration factors. What we found was that the game of adulteration is sophisticated, that the groups that were selling raw honey, and for all of you who are listening to this, please realize why we chose them. When we sent the first group of 8 brands to the NDDB lab, and they all passed the test, we wanted to find out whether this had any variation, and that we should therefore look for some smaller brands. Sonal and Amit then did a basic survey to look at which are the small brands which are selling, and they also looked at some of the good brands that they were finding that they had good reputations. And they did an eeny, meeny, miny, mo, because the small brands, there are many. I mean, people have asked today, have we tested the Girijan honey? Have we tested Sikkim honey? Have we tested? There are many brands that we could not test. There's no way we could have got tested. We have very limited resources. We have really stretched our resources and to do this survey, to do this study. But what I am worried about is, why did the small brands fail? And they failed not even with a sophisticated syrup, which is meant to bypass the tests. They actually failed on basic parameters, C4. What does C4 mean? That they were adulterating their honey with as something as cheap as sugarcane, not even rice syrup, just sugarcane. Now, this worries me because if the smaller brands who are now positioning themselves as brands with the difference, brands which are serving us raw honey, if they start failing the test of confidence, of trust of consumers, then you are really down a slippery slope. Now, this is where self-discipline, self-management will have to come in. These brands, we do not want, they of course are accountable to FSSAI, but FSSAI basically is not taking action against any of the brands. So that's neither here nor there. The fact is, these brands are accountable to consumers. And we go to them for this reason, that they give us raw honey. So we need to make sure that there is some measure of self-control, because otherwise what Matthew's doing, what Stan is doing, what Tapas is doing, which is extraordinary. You are connecting the raw honey, the actual producer, the forest producer to the honey. I mean, how much more pure can it get? And yet, if we lose the confidence, we will lose all of this. So we need to make sure that in all this, Amit, as I end it, and I would say that this actually puts together, and thank you, Matthew, Stan, and Tapas, for giving us these leads. We will now work on this. As I see it, CSC's agenda has to be to work on the whole issue of food systems. How do you design food systems which are good for nutrition, which is really about health, and making sure that we don't compromise the health of people. They're good for livelihoods, which is the connection that you have brought today, connection to the community, connection to the livelihoods of people, to the money that is going into the hands of people. Tapas told us today that they have 2 levels of money going back. One, going back directly to the profits will go back as well. So I think this is extraordinary. And then, of course, the whole sustainability issue in the age of climate change. I've taken longer, Amit, I'm sorry, but I just was fascinated by what I heard. So please forgive me for taking this time. But thank you.
No, I can just tell you each second you took was worth it. I mean, but so informative. I mean, the way you see it, Sunita, it has not only helped, I'm sure, me or the other colleagues, but also all the speakers, and I can see that how they are responding on the chat box. So thank you very much, Sunita, for letting us know how you see this problem and how you see the solutions. So with that, I think I should thank everyone, all the speakers, co-speakers, panelists, my team at CSC, Arnab, Sonal, Matthew, Stan, Tapas, and I would also like to kind of thank all the participants who have taken time out and stayed there till the end for this informative discussion and putting up so very interesting questions to us. So we'll try our best to answer, to keep on engaging in these discussions subsequently. I just want to let you know, a lot of these, almost all of the information that we have, that we produced during the study is available on the website. So there's a lot of question about where this information is available. It's the presentations that we have made, the responses we have given, the press statements that we have made, the lab results summary, the English and Hindi story, everything is available on the website. And so for everyone's benefit. So with that, thank you very much, everyone. Have a good